If someone had told me a year ago that my meticulously ordered life would be upended by a man who moved like a controlled storm, I would have filed the suggestion under improbable fiction. My world was one of quiet solitude, of paper and dust, and the gentle hum of climate control in the hospital's subbasement archives. I was Leo, the keeper of records, a ghost in a labyrinth of forgotten histories. My existence was a routine, a comfortable, predictable loop of cataloging, preserving, and being utterly, completely alone. And I thought I liked it that way. I had convinced myself that solitude was a fortress, not a cage. Then there was Dr. Julian Vance. He was not a part of my world. He belonged to the bright, sterile chaos upstairs. The world of beeping machines, sanitized corridors, and life-or-death decisions made in the blink of an eye. He was a cardiothoracic surgeon, a name spoken with a mixture of reverence and fear by the nurses. I saw him only in passing, a flash of blue scrubs and a confident stride that seemed to cleave the air in two. He was tall, with shoulders that strained the fabric of his coat, and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and impatience. His eyes were the thing, though, a sharp, piercing gray that seemed to see everything and dismiss most of it as irrelevant. They swept over me in the hallway once or twice, but there was no recognition. To him, I was just part of the scenery, a fixture, less than a ghost. And I watched him. Of course I did. From the safe distance of my obscurity, it was an addiction. I saw the way he'd rub the back of his neck when he was tired, a gesture of profound weariness that momentarily cracked his armor of detached competence. I saw the faint, silvery scar that cut through his left eyebrow, a tiny flaw in his otherwise severe perfection. I saw him speak to a frightened child in the waiting room once, his voice, usually so clipped and authoritative, dropping to a low, gentle rumble. These observations were my secrets. They were pressed between the pages of my own internal catalog, filed under longing and cross-referenced with impossible. He was this force of nature, this brilliant, beautiful man, and I was me, the quiet man in the basement. The distance between us wasn't just the 4 floors of the hospital. It was a chasm, a social and emotional galaxy. He was the sun, and I was a forgotten moon orbiting a planet that had long since died. This barrier was my safety. It allowed me to look without the terrifying risk of being seen. My routine was my armor. Wake at 6. Coffee black. Walk to the hospital by 7:30. Descend into the quiet, cool air of the archives. The scent of old paper and binding glue was my oxygen. Here, I was in control. Every file had its place. Every life, neatly documented and stored in acid-free boxes. It was a kingdom of silence, and I was its undisputed and only ruler. The chaos of the emergency room, the raw, messy business of life and death upstairs, felt a million miles away. Julian Vance was the embodiment of that chaos. He was everything my life was not. Loud when my world was silent. Decisive where I was contemplative. Seen where I was invisible. My fascination with him was a dangerous sort of fire I tended in the hearth of my own loneliness, a warmth I knew could easily burn me if I ever got too close. So I stayed in the basement. I kept my distance. It was safer that way. The disruption came, as disruptions often do, without warning and with the full force of nature's fury. The sky had been a bruised purple all afternoon, the air thick and heavy with unspoken threats. The first flakes of snow were a novelty. By evening, it was a blizzard, a whiteout that descended upon the city and choked it into submission. The wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling the very foundations of the old hospital building. An announcement crackled over the PA system. A code silver. The hospital was on lockdown. No one in, no one out. The city had declared a state of emergency. All non-essential personnel were to shelter in place. I was, by every definition, non-essential. My office, a small, windowless cube carved out of the archives, suddenly became my entire world. It was my sanctuary, but now it felt like a trap. The main power flickered, died, and then the emergency generators kicked in, casting the subterranean corridors in a humming, apocalyptic orange glow. I made a small nest for myself with a spare blanket I kept for cold nights and resigned myself to a long, lonely vigil. Hours bled into one another. The silence of the archives was different now, heavier. It was punctuated by the distant, muffled sounds of the storm and the groan of the old building. I tried to read, but the words swam on the page. My carefully constructed routine had been shattered, and a thread of anxiety began to unravel inside me. That's when the door to my office creaked open. I looked up, my heart seizing in my chest. And there he was, Dr. Julian Vance. He filled the doorway, his broad frame seeming to suck all the air from my tiny room. His blue scrubs were rumpled, his hair was a mess, and the exhaustion I'd only ever glimpsed from afar was now a brutal reality etched into every line on his face. He looked less like a god and more like a man who had been to war. He squinted into the dim light of my desk lamp. Is anyone in here? His voice was rough, frayed at the edges. I could only nod, my own voice having abandoned me entirely. He sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of the entire hospital. My on-call room on the third floor has a burst pipe. Flooded. Everywhere else is chaos. He gestured vaguely upwards. I just need somewhere quiet. For an hour. Then I have to go back. He wasn't asking for permission so much as stating a fact. He didn't wait for an answer. He stepped inside, letting the heavy fire door swing shut behind him, sealing us in together. The space, which had always felt perfectly sized for one, was now impossibly small. His presence was a physical force, a change in the atmospheric pressure. He smelled of antiseptic, coffee, and something else, a clean, masculine scent that was just him. My fortress had been breached. The storm was no longer just outside. It was in my office, and it had a name. Julian. He sank into the worn visitor's chair opposite my desk, a piece of furniture that had likely been there since the hospital was built. He dropped his head into his hands, his fingers digging into his dark hair. The sheer, unadulterated fatigue rolling off him was a palpable wave. For the first time, he wasn't Dr. Vance, the formidable surgeon. He was just a man, cornered by a storm and his own exhaustion. My heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs. Say something. Do something. But my mind was a blank slate. What do you say to the sun when it unexpectedly decides to take refuge in your tiny, forgotten corner of the universe? He didn't seem to expect conversation. The silence stretched, filled only by the hum of the emergency lights and his own deep, ragged breaths. This was my chance to truly observe, not from distance, but up close. The proximity was terrifying and exhilarating. I could see the dark stubble shadowing his jaw, the faint tremor in his long fingers. The scar on his eyebrow was more pronounced in the dim light, a pale slash against his tan skin. It looked like it had been a nasty cut once. I wondered, inanely, how he got it. He shifted in the chair, wincing as he moved. A low groan escaped his lips. He was in pain. All the confidence, the arrogance I had projected onto him, was gone, stripped away by sheer physical depletion. What was left was something raw and vulnerable. And in that moment, the dynamic between us, the one that had existed only in my head, shifted on its axis. He was the one in need, and I, in my own small way, was the one with the power to provide comfort. I have some painkillers, I heard myself say. The voice was mine, but it sounded thin, distant. He lifted his head, his gray eyes focusing on me, as if for the first time. There was a flicker of surprise, then a deep, bone-deep weariness that seemed to settle even deeper. Yeah, in my desk. I fumbled with the drawer, my hands clumsy. I pulled out a small first aid kit and a bottle of water I kept for emergencies. I pushed them across the desk towards him. And a blanket. It gets cold down here. I gestured to the folded wool blanket on my shelf. He watched me, his gaze unervingly direct. He didn't move to take them. For a moment, I thought he would refuse, that his pride would snap back into place. But then he just nodded, a short, sharp gesture of capitulation. He reached for the bottle of water. At the same time, I nudged it closer. And our hands touched. It wasn't a brush. It was a solid, undeniable contact. The back of his hand against mine. His skin was warm, calloused, and a jolt of pure electricity shot up my arm, fizzing through my veins and exploding in my chest. It was a lightning strike in the quiet room. A supernova. My breath hitched. The world narrowed to that single point of contact, that small patch of skin where his reality collided with mine. I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned. My face flushed with heat. 1,000 apologies died on my lips. Panic. He knows. He felt it. He thinks you're a freak. But Julian didn't seem to notice. Or if he did, he gave no sign. He just took the bottle, dry swallowed 2 pills, and leaned his head back against the wall, closing his eyes. The moment passed. For him, it was nothing, a non-event. For me, it was everything. The brand of his touch was still seared into my skin. My carefully ordered internal world was now in complete, utter disarray. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic prisoner rattling its cage. He was a doctor, a man of science and action. I was a man of feelings and quiet observation. In that moment, he needed something I could give. Not medical expertise, not life-saving skill, but a quiet room. A glass of water. A moment of peace. The playing field, which had always been so impossibly tilted, felt suddenly, strangely level. I retrieved the blanket, and, with a hesitation that felt like it lasted an eternity, I draped it over his shoulders. He was so still I thought he might have fallen asleep, but as the wool settled around him, his eyes opened a fraction. He looked at me, a long, unreadable expression on his face. "Thanks," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. And then his eyes closed again. I retreated to my side of the desk, my body thrumming with a nervous energy that had nowhere to go. I was trapped in this small, intimate space with the object of my years-long secret affection. He was asleep, or close to it, vulnerable and unguarded in my chair. The storm raged outside. The hospital hummed with its own contained crisis. But in this room, the world had shrunk to the space of a few feet, to the sound of his breathing, to the heat still tingling on my skin where we had touched. The thaw had begun, and I was terrified of the flood that might follow. The hours that followed were a strange, suspended reality. Julian slept a deep, exhausted sleep that was more like a surrender. His head lolled to one side, his breathing even and slow. The harsh lines of his face softened in repose, making him look younger, less formidable. The silence in the room was no longer empty. It was filled with his presence. It was a living, breathing thing. I didn't work. I couldn't focus. I just watched him. It felt illicit, like reading a private diary. I cataloged the details. The way his dark eyelashes rested against his cheekbones. The slight, unconscious frown that creased his brow even in sleep, as if he were wrestling with some problem in his dreams. His hands, those capable, life-saving hands, rested loosely in his lap, the long fingers slightly curled. They looked surprisingly graceful for hands that held so much power. My office, my sterile, ordered sanctuary, had become something else entirely. It was a sick bay, a shelter, a confessional waiting to happen. The air was thick with unspoken things, with the charged energy of our forced proximity. The metaphor was not lost on me. He, the man who mended broken hearts, had brought his own weary heart into my quiet corner of the world, and I had no idea what to do with it. My stomach was a knot of bees. Every creak of the building, every distant shout, made me jump, terrified our bubble would be burst. I wanted him to stay, and I desperately wanted him to go. His presence was a beautiful agony. It was the fulfillment of a fantasy I'd never dared to fully articulate, and it was fraught with the terror of imminent rejection. After what felt like a lifetime, he began to stir. He shifted in the chair, a low-groan rumbling in his chest. He blinked his eyes, opened slowly, his gaze hazy and unfocused. He looked around the small office, a flicker of confusion crossing his face before memory returned. His eyes landed on me. "How long was I out?" he asked, his voice a gravelly rasp. "A few hours," I said, my own voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet. "About 3. He scrubbed a hand over his face, pushing his hair back. He looked more human than I had ever seen him, stripped of his professional armor. Just a man waking up in a strange room. The blanket I had put on him had slipped down to his lap. He looked at it, then back at me. A strange expression flickered in his eyes. "You didn't have to do that," he said. It wasn't an accusation, but it wasn't exactly gratitude either. It was a statement of fact, laced with a question he didn't seem to know how to ask. "You looked cold." I replied simply, my heart starting its frantic rhythm again. He just nodded, staring at the floor. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It was awake, aware. He was looking at me, really looking at me, and I felt stripped bare under his gaze, as if he could see the years of secret observation, the silent longing. I felt my cheeks grow warm, and I had to look away, focusing on a crack in the plaster on the wall. "I've seen you before," he said, his voice quiet. "In the cafeteria, in the hallways. You're the records guy, right?" The casual label stung more than it should have. "I'm the archivist." Leo, he repeated, testing the name on his tongue. It sounded foreign and intimate all at once coming from his lips. "Julian." We sat there, two men who had shared a space for hours but had only just been properly introduced. The storm outside seemed to have quieted its rage, settling into a persistent, muffled howl. The room felt even smaller, the air charged and heavy. He was watching me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. It was the same focused look I'd seen him give to patient charts and x-rays, a look of intense analysis, of trying to solve a puzzle. I realized, with a jolt of panic, that I had been staring. Not just glancing, but properly staring at him while he slept while he was talking. My gaze had probably been full of all the things I kept locked away inside. It was my curse, this inability to hide the way I felt, my emotions always threatening to spill over. And then he asked the question, the one that broke everything open. "Why do you keep looking at me that way?" The words were dropped into the silence like stones into a still pond, the ripples spreading out to touch every corner of the small room. It wasn't accusatory. It was genuinely curious. He wasn't angry. He was just asking. And it was so much worse. My mind went utterly blank. A roaring static filled my ears. I could lie. I could make something up. I could say he had something on his face. I could pretend I was just lost in thought. The safe options. The cowardly options. But looking at him then, at the genuine, tired curiosity in his eyes, the vulnerability he had shown by simply falling asleep in my presence, a lie felt like a betrayal. A betrayal of this strange, fragile truce that had formed between us. My throat was tight, my palms were sweating. I took a breath, and I chose a sliver of the truth, the most terrifying and honest thing I could manage. "I'm sorry," I whispered, the words barely audible. I find you compelling." The word felt inadequate, clinical, but it was the only one I could find. "You're very present." It's hard not to look. He didn't laugh. He didn't recoil. He just watched me, his gray eyes searching my face. The silence stretched for a full minute. I wanted the floor to swallow me whole. I had done it. I had ruined it. I had made this weird, accidental intimacy into something awkward and creepy. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a murmur. "Present. That's a new one. Most people say intimidating. Or asshole." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. No one ever really looks. They see the white coat. They see the surgeon. They don't see the man who hasn't had a decent night's sleep in a week, and who is pretty sure he left his oven on at home. His confession hung in the air between us. A small, startlingly vulnerable admission of his own loneliness, his own feeling of being seen but not understood. He felt like a symbol, just as I felt like a ghost. We were two sides of the same invisible coin. "I see that too," I said, my voice gaining a little strength. "I see the exhaustion. I see the scar over your eye. I saw you calm down a little girl who was crying for her mother in the ER waiting room 3 months ago. You made a bird out of your gloves for her." His eyes widened slightly. The surprise on his face was genuine. "You saw that?" I just nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. I had revealed too much. I had shown my hand, the years of silent watching laid bare. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, closing the small distance between us even more. The air crackled. No one has ever paid that kind of attention. He wasn't looking at me with clinical curiosity anymore. It was something else, something softer, something that looked terrifyingly like recognition. And then he was moving. It was slow, deliberate. He pushed himself out of his chair and knelt on the floor in front of me, so we were at eye level. My breath caught in my lungs. My heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. He was so close, I could feel the warmth radiating from him. I could smell the faint scent of coffee on his breath. "Leo," he said, and my name was a question, a plea, a statement, all at once. He raised a hand, and I flinched, expecting, I don't know what, rejection, a pat on the shoulder. But his fingers were gentle as they came to rest on my cheek. His thumb stroked softly over my jawline. The touch was electric, 1,000 times more potent than when our hands had brushed. This was intentional. This was a choice. His gaze dropped to my lips. My own eyes fluttered closed. This couldn't be happening. This was a dream, a fantasy spun from exhaustion and the strange magic of the storm. And then he kissed me. It was not a kiss of passion or frantic desire. It was slow, hesitant, a question. His lips were soft, tentative against mine. It was a kiss of discovery, of profound, world-altering surprise. It tasted of coffee and sleepless nights and a loneliness that mirrored my own. I responded with equal hesitation, a shy, trembling press of my own lips against his. It was a confirmation, an answer. Yes, I see you too. The kiss deepened slightly, a gentle exploration. It was the most honest conversation I had ever had. In that single, silent act, years of unspoken feelings were confessed and acknowledged. The distance between us, the 4 floors, the professional chasm, the universe of difference, it all collapsed into nothing. There was only this, the quiet of my office, the faint hum of the lights, and the impossible, undeniable reality of Julian Vance's lips on mine. The turning point had come and gone, and I knew, with terrifying certainty, that nothing would ever be the same again. The storm broke with the dawn. The howling wind softened to a whisper, and a pale, watery light began to filter through the high, grimy windows at the end of the corridor. The world outside was waking up, and with it, the spell that had held us captive in my small office began to fray at the edges. The kiss had ended as gently as it began. We had simply stayed there for a moment, foreheads resting against each other, breathing the same air. No words were spoken. None were needed. But now, with the sounds of the hospital slowly returning to life, the distant clatter of a cart, the murmur of voices, reality began to intrude. Julian pulled away first. He stood up, his movement stiff. He didn't look at me. He ran a hand through his already messy hair, his back to me. The space between us was suddenly a chasm again, filled with a new, terrifying kind of silence. The silence of what now? My body felt cold without his proximity. I was a mess of raw, exposed nerves. A spiral of doubt began its insidious crawl up my spine. It was a mistake, a fluke, a moment of weakness brought on by stress and exhaustion. I have to. He started, his voice rough. He gestured vaguely toward the door. Rounds. I have to check on my post-ops, of course, I said, my voice a hollow echo of its former self. I sounded like a polite stranger. The intimacy of the night might as well have been a dream. He turned, and for a second, he looked at me. His expression was a chaotic mix of confusion, exhaustion, and something else I couldn't name. It might have been fear. He opened his mouth as if to say more, then closed it. The confident surgeon was back, his armor clanging back into place piece by piece. Right, he said, the single word clipped and final. And then he was gone. The heavy door swung shut, the latch clicking into place with a sound like a jail cell locking. I was left alone in my office. The air still held the faint scent of him. The blanket he had used was still pooled on the visitor's chair. My lips still tingled from the memory of his. The room, my sanctuary, now felt like a crime scene. Evidence of an impossible event was everywhere, and I was the only witness. The morning after, the cruelest part of any fantasy. The cold light of day that reveals the cracks and imperfections. I sat at my desk, motionless, as the hospital fully woke up around me. The lockdown was lifted. People's footsteps echoed in hallways. The world was moving on, but I was frozen in the moment he walked out the door. My anxiety, which had been a quiet hum, now roared to life. It was a physical entity, a cold, heavy weight in my stomach. I replayed the kiss, his confession, his departure, over and over. Each time, my inner critic grew louder. He regrets it. He's straight. He was just tired and confused. You took advantage of his vulnerability. You're the creepy records guy who stares, and now he knows it. He's probably telling his doctor friends about it right now, having a good laugh. The self-recrimination was a bitter poison. The hope that had bloomed in my chest overnight wilted and died, leaving behind a black, aching void. My old solitude, the one I had worn like a comfortable coat, was gone. In its place was a sharp, painful absence. The office wasn't just quiet now, it was empty. It was missing him. The next few days were a special kind of hell. I went through the motions of my job, my hands moving with muscle memory while my mind was a whirlwind of obsessive thoughts. Every time the phone rang, my heart leaped into my throat, thinking it might be him. Every time someone walked past my door, I looked up, a pathetic, hopeful jolt shooting through me. It was never him. I saw him once from a distance at the end of a long corridor. He was surrounded by a group of residents, his head bent as he looked at a chart, his voice the familiar, authoritative clip I knew from before. He was Dr. Vance again, fully armored, fully in control. He didn't look in my direction. He didn't even seem aware that I existed on the same planet, let alone in the same building. It was confirmation of my worst fears. The storm had been a temporary madness, a fever dream. Now it was over, and he had returned to his world, leaving me in the wreckage of mine. The silence from him was deafening. It was an answer in itself. It said, let's forget this ever happened. I tried. I really did. I tried to put him back in the box labeled impossible. I tried to go back to being the invisible archivist. But you can't untouch a hand. You can't unkiss a mouth. You can't unknow the feeling of someone seeing you, truly seeing you for the first time. The memory of it was a ghost that haunted my every waking moment. The silence wasn't just an absence of sound. It was a presence, a physical weight pressing down on me, suffocating me with what-ifs and regrets. I had tasted connection, and now the loneliness was unbearable. On the fourth day, I had given up. I had accepted it. I sat at my desk, a cold cup of coffee beside me, staring at a manifest from 1958 without seeing a single word. I was building my walls back up, brick by painful brick. It was better this way, safer. The brief, beautiful agony of that night was too high a price to pay for this lingering, desolate pain. The door opened. I didn't even look up. I assumed it was one of the administrative assistants with a new box of files. Leo, my head snapped up so fast a pain shot through my neck. It was him, Julian. He stood in the doorway, not in his scrubs, but in civilian clothes, a pair of worn jeans and a simple gray sweater. He looked just as exhausted as he had during the storm, but this was a different kind of weariness. It was an emotional exhaustion. There were dark circles under his eyes, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. He looked as wrecked as I felt. He stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him. He didn't sit down. He just stood there, his hands shoved into his pockets, looking at the floor, then at me, then back at the floor. The confident surgeon was gone. This was just Julian, a man who looked lost and profoundly uncertain. I'm an idiot, he said finally, his voice low and hoarse. And I'm sorry, I just stared, my mind struggling to catch up. I couldn't form a response. He took a breath, a shaky one. I panicked. After that night, I walked out of here, and the whole world came rushing back in, and I didn't know what to do, what any of it meant. He finally met my gaze, and his eyes were filled with a raw, desperate honesty. I've spent my entire life being one thing: a son, a student, a doctor, a surgeon. It's all neat boxes, labels. I know the protocols. I know the steps. And then this. You. It doesn't fit in any of the boxes. He took a step closer. I've never felt what I felt in this room. Not with anyone. The way you looked at me. It wasn't like I was a puzzle to be solved or a problem to be fixed. It was just seeing, and it terrified me, because I think I saw you too, and I didn't know what to do with it. So I did what I always do when I'm scared. I ran. I hid behind my work. My heart, which had felt like a dead stone in my chest for days, began to beat again, a slow, painful, hopeful rhythm. He wasn't rejecting me. He was just as scared as I was. I thought you regretted it. I managed to say, the words scraping my throat. I thought it was a mistake. No, he said, the words sharp, emphatic. He shook his head. No, not a mistake. The mistake was walking away. The mistake was the silence. These last few days being back in the noise, in the routine, but feeling completely disconnected. It's been hell, because the only place I felt real, felt seen, was in this quiet little room with you. He closed the remaining distance between us, stopping right in front of my desk. He looked down at his hands, then back up at me. This is new territory for me, Leo. I don't have a map. I'm probably going to be clumsy. I'm probably going to screw it up. But I don't want to go back to how things were before. I can't. The vulnerability in his voice was my undoing. All the walls I had been so desperately trying to rebuild crumbled into dust. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single key on a plain metal ring. He held it out, placing it on the desk between us. It made a small, definitive sound against the wood. That's to my apartment, he said quietly. I'm off this weekend. My first real time off in months. I was thinking I might try to figure out how to cook something that doesn't come from a vending machine. He gave a small, self-deprecating smile. Come over, if you want. We could just talk. Or not talk. Whatever. I don't want to be in a place where you're not. It was a tangible act. A promise. An invitation not just into his home, but into his life. It was more terrifying and more wonderful than anything I could have imagined. This was the recommitment. The step out of the storm and into a new, uncertain daylight. I looked from the key, a small, solid piece of metal, to his face, to his hopeful, frightened eyes. And for the first time in my life, I didn't retreat into the safety of my shell. I reached out, and my fingers closed around the key, the cool metal a comforting weight in my palm. Okay, I said, and my voice was steady. Okay, Julian. I'd like that. A wave of relief washed over his face. So profound, it was like watching a great weight being lifted from his shoulders. The smile that followed was small, but it was real. And this time it reached his eyes. The weekend arrived bathed in a soft, bright sunlight that made the snow-covered city sparkle. Walking to Julian's apartment, key in my hand, felt surreal. Every step was a step into a new life, a future I hadn't even allowed myself to dream of. My anxiety was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was overshadowed by a fragile, burgeoning hope. His apartment was on the top floor of an old brownstone, filled with light from huge, beautiful windows. It was normal, a little messy, a stack of medical journals on the coffee table, a guitar leaning in one corner, a half-dead plant on the windowsill. It was the space of a man who lived, not just worked. It was him. He opened the door before I could use the key, a nervous energy radiating from him. He was wearing the same gray sweater, and he offered me a smile that was both shy and incredibly warm. You came, he said, as if he still couldn't quite believe it. You gave me a key, I replied, holding it up. Felt like I should, and just like that, the tension broke. We spent the day in a comfortable, easy rhythm. We didn't talk about the storm, or the kiss, or the terrible silence that followed. Not at first. We talked about books and music and the ridiculously bad coffee in the hospital cafeteria. I learned that the scar on his eyebrow was from falling out of a tree when he was 10. He learned that I had once wanted to be a botanist, which explained my horror at his dying plant. He tried to cook. The result was a spectacularly burned pasta dish that we ended up scraping into the trash, laughing until tears ran down our faces. We ordered pizza instead and ate it sitting on the floor of his living room, our knees brushing. Each accidental touch was no longer a jolt of panic, but a small, reassuring spark of connection. Later, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, we finally fell quiet. He was looking at me with that same intense, searching expression from my office, but now it was laced with a soft affection that made my heart ache in the best possible way. "I'm glad you're here, Leo," he said, his voice quiet. "Me too," I whispered, and it was true. For the first time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The quiet of my archives had been a comfortable silence, but this shared, easy silence with him was a living, breathing thing. It was peace. The next morning, I woke up in his bed. I had fallen asleep on his couch, and he must have carried me. I was tucked under a heavy comforter, and the morning light was streaming through the window. For a split second, the old panic flared, the morning after anxiety, the fear of finding myself alone. But then I smelled coffee. I found him in the kitchen, barefoot, wearing a rumpled t-shirt, pouring 2 mugs of coffee. He looked over his shoulder and smiled when he saw me, a genuine, easy smile that lit up his whole face. There was no awkwardness, no regret, just a simple, domestic intimacy that felt more profound than any grand, passionate gesture. "Morning," he said, handing me a mug. I figured I couldn't mess this up as badly as the pasta. I took the mug, our fingers brushing. This time, I didn't pull away. I let my fingers linger against his for a moment, a small, silent acknowledgement of this new reality. We stood there in his sun-drenched kitchen, drinking coffee, and I felt a sense of rightness settle deep in my bones. My life had been a carefully curated collection of quiet moments, a narrative of solitude I had written for myself. I had been the archivist of my own lonely history. Then Julian Vance, the brilliant, intimidating surgeon from the 4th floor, had stumbled into my basement during a snowstorm. He was a plot twist I never saw coming, a disruption that tore my narrative to shreds. He didn't just break my routine. He broke open the fortress I had built around my heart. He had seen me. Not the records guy, not the quiet fixture in a basement, but me. Lau. And in seeing me, he had given me the courage to finally see myself. Not as a ghost in the archives, but as a man capable of connection, of love, of sharing a quiet morning and a cup of coffee with someone who mattered. He hadn't just saved lives in the operating room. In his own clumsy, beautiful way, he had saved mine. He changed everything. But it makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many of us are just one storm, one power outage, one moment of forced proximity away from finding the one person who truly sees us for who we are? How many of us are just waiting for our own beautiful, terrifying disruption? Let me know what you think. I'd love to read your stories in the comments. And if you want to hear more about how love can be found in the most unexpected of places, please consider subscribing. It would mean the world.